principles shape
And remember, it was Albert Einstein.
I
These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage.
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 Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage.
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 Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
China's 12-point plan for peace. Watch this space. China's position on the political statement of the Ukraine crisis, respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Universally recognized international law, including the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, must be strictly observed. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries must be effectively upheld. All countries, big or small, strong or weak, rich or poor, are equal members of the international community. All parties should jointly uphold the basic norms governing international relations and defend international fairness and justice. Equal and uniform application of international law should be promoted, while double standards must be rejected. Point 2. Abandoning the Cold War mentality. The security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously and addressed properly. There's no simple solution to a complex issue. All parties should, following the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and bearing in mind the long-term peace and stability of the world, help forge a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. All parties should oppose the pursuit of one's own security at the cost of other security, prevent bloc confrontation, and work together for peace and stability on the Eurasian continent. I was surprised by the usage of the term European here. Ceasing hostilities. Conflict and war benefit no one. All parties must stay rational.
The whole notion of logic.
And excuse restraint, avoid fanning the flames and aggravating tensions, and prevent the crisis from deteriorating further or even spiraling out of control. All parties should support Russia and Ukraine in working in the same direction, and resume direct dialogue as quickly as possible, so as to gradually de-escalate the situation and ultimately reach a comprehensive ceasefire. Resuming peace talks. Dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. All efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis must be encouraged and supported. The international community should stay committed to the right approach of promoting talks for peace. Help parties to the conflict open the door to a political settlement as soon as possible, and create conditions and platforms for the resumption of negotiation. China will continue to play a constructive role in this regard. resolving the humanitarian crisis. All measures conducive to easing the humanitarian crisis must be encouraged and supported. Humanitarian operations should follow the principles of neutrality and impartiality, and humanitarian issues should not be politicized. The safety of civilians must be effectively protected, and the humanitarian corridors should be set up for the evacuation of civilians from conflict zones. Efforts are needed to increase humanitarian assistance to relevant areas, improve humanitarian conditions, and provide rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access, with a view to preventing a humanitarian crisis on a large scale. The UN should be supported in playing a coordinating role in channeling humanitarian aid to conflict zones, protecting civilians and prisoners of war. Parties to the conflict should strictly abide by international human law or humanitarian law, avoiding attacking civilians or civilian facilities, protect women, children, and other victims of the conflict, and respect the basic rights of POWs. China supports the exchange of POWs between Russia and Ukraine and calls on all parties to create more favorable conditions for this purpose. Keeping nuclear power plants safe. China opposes armed attacks against nuclear power plants or other peaceful nuclear facilities and calls on all parties to comply with international law, including the Convention on Nuclear Safety, and resolutely avoid man-made nuclear accidents. China supports the International Atomic Energy Agency in playing a constructive role in promoting the safety and security of peaceful nuclear facilities, reducing strategic risks. Nuclear weapons must not be used, and nuclear wars must not be fought. The threat or use of nuclear weapons should be opposed. Nuclear proliferation must be prevented and nuclear crises avoided. China opposes the research, development, and use of chemical and biological weapons by any country under any circumstances, facilitating grain exports. All parties need to implement the Black Sea Grain Initiative signed by Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and the UN fully and effectively in a balanced manner, and support the UN in playing an important role in this regard. The Cooperation Initiative on Global Food Security proposed by China provides a feasible solution to the global food crisis. Stopping unilateral sanctions. Unilateral sanctions and maximum pressure cannot solve the issue. They only create new problems. China opposes unilateral sanctions unauthorized by the UN Security Council. Relevant countries should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction against other countries so as to do their share in de-escalating the Ukraine crisis and create conditions for developing countries to grow their economies and better their lives of their people. Keeping industrial and supply chains stable. All parties should earnestly maintain the existing world economic system and oppose using the world economy as a tool or a weapon for political purposes. Joint efforts are needed to mitigate the spillovers of the crisis and prevent it from disrupting international cooperation in energy, finance, food, trade, and transportation, and undermining the global economic recovery. And finally, 12, promoting post-conflict reconstruction. The international community needs to take measures to support post-conflict reconstruction in conflict zones. China stands ready to provide assistance and play a constructive role in this endeavor. And from Dev Discourse, Russia welcomes China peace plan, says it's open to talks. Russia welcomed on Friday Chinese proposals to resolve the conflict in Ukraine and said it was open to achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation through political and diplomatic means. China's called for a comprehensive ceasefire as part of a 12-point plan for dealing with the war, which began a year ago when Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. Russia welcomed on Friday Chinese proposals to resolve the conflict in Ukraine and said it was open to achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation through political and diplomatic means. China's called for a comprehensive ceasefire as part of a 12-point plan for dealing with the war, which began a year ago when Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. We appreciate the sincere desire of our Chinese friends to contribute to resolving the conflict in Ukraine by peaceful means. We share the views of Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said in a statement. With regard to the Ukraine crisis, Russia is open to achieving the goals of the special military operation by political and diplomatic means, Zakharova said. However, this would also mean recognizing new territorial realities in Ukraine, Zakharova said, referring to Russia's unilateral annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, as well as of Crimea. Ukraine has rejected the Chinese proposal unless it resolves or it involves Russia withdrawing its troops to its 1991 borders when the Soviet Union was dissolved. Although Kiev has also said it's open to parts of the plan, Kiev's Western allies have also reacted coolly to the Chinese proposals, with NATO saying Beijing did not have much credibility as a mediator in view of its close ties with Russia. And a clip from CNA. China calls for Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, peace talks, and 12-point policy paper.
China is urging Russia and Ukraine to resume peace talks. Beijing is pushing for negotiations, saying that is the only viable way to resolve conflict and reach a comprehensive ceasefire. The proposed negotiation is a major focus of the 12-point policy paper China released today.
我们一贯主张，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应当得到鼓励和支持。中方愿在关于政治解决乌克兰危机的中国立场文件基础上，继续同国际社会一道，为政治解决乌克兰危机发挥建设性作用。
Other key points: Beijing's rejection of unilateral sanctions not authorized by the UN Security Council. It's also made clear its strong opposition to the use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons by any country under any circumstances. China also calls for humanitarian corridors for evacuating civilians and proposes steps to ensure the export of grain from Ukraine. Disruptions in the past year have caused a spike in global food prices. And for more, we're joined by Lo Min live for us from Shanghai. Min, there has been skepticism, but can Beijing do much to bring warring parties together to agree on any kind of ceasefire?
Well, those looking for something new from Beijing are likely to be disappointed with this policy paper because it's mainly a reiteration of China's principles and is lacking on those specific details that would have made it actionable. And this conflict, it looks like it's headed into a deadlock both in the battlefield and also on the diplomatic front, because all the stakeholders have such competing sets of demands that seem so irreconcilable. The West wants China to condemn Russia, to stop buying up Russian oil and coal, and to join them in the sanctions against Moscow. But all these are things that China has resolutely refused to do. In fact, China is calling for the exact opposite, calling for the end of these unilateral sanctions, saying that they are a form of long-arm jurisdiction that interferes in the developmental rights of all nations. But this demand from China is likely to fall on deaf ears in the West. It's almost unthinkable that the US and its allies would even consider lifting sanctions on Moscow. In fact, they are looking to add more. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, they have their own demands for the Russian troops to pull out from their territory, while the Russians will likely want some form of NATO guarantee on the non-expansion of NATO. So all of these clashing demands, it just looks like there is no easy way out.
Oh, thank you for that. Lo Min reporting live just there from Shanghai. Oh, China is urging.
And from South China Morning, this is China releases 12-point position paper on 1-year anniversary of Russian invasion of Ukraine. And from Makad TV, NATO Secretary General with Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, and President Ursula von, this is the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear journalists, it is my great pleasure to see so many of you here today, as it is our Independence Day. Dear Jens, dear Ursula, I'm so glad that you accepted my invitation to join us here on our Independence Day when we celebrate our 105th anniversary of Estonia. This means a lot to me, and it also means a lot to Estonian people, so thank you for being here. Let me start by sharing a thought by De-Escalation. The secret to happiness is freedom, again. For Estonians, the 24th of February has always been about celebrating freedom. We know that freedom comes at a price. You need to fight for it. Allied presence here in Estonia contributes every day to the security of our country and the alliance as a whole. But Estonia takes its own part of the burden increasingly seriously. We have been significantly boosting our defense spending. It's nearly 3% now. The will of this, I propose that EU member states jointly procure ammunition for Ukraine. During the pandemic, we were able to react quickly to jointly procure vaccines. Let us act quickly now and send more ammunition to Ukraine. We must keep in mind that the threat Russia poses is a long-term one. In addition to the conventional war, they are also waging a hybrid war to create chaos and divide us. All European countries need to invest more in their own defense and resilience. We cannot be afraid of Russian terror tactics. If we fall for Russia's threats, we will wake up in a much more dangerous world. Ukraine and Russia's other neighbors are not afraid. So why should those countries who are further from Ukraine be afraid? The way this war against Ukraine ends will define peace for generations to come. For any peace to last, there needs to be accountability. Russian crimes against Ukraine and its people must not go unpunished, and no Russian leader can be immune from responsibility. As Team Europe and Team NATO, we have shown significant unity and resolve over the past year. Looking ahead, these are key words we must take with us: courage, belief, accountability, and leave no room for fear. Thank you.
Thank you. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, please.
Yes, thank you, Prime Minister, Secretary General, dear Jens, dear Kaya. Thank you very much for hosting us in Tallinn on such a special day. Indeed, the day when 105 years ago, Estonia declared its independence. Estonia's determination to remain a free and independent country has been put to the test time and again. But independence was finally restored on the 20th of August 1991. And I also want to share a thought or quote of a famous Estonian, the former president, Lennart Meri, who said, "Europe is not geography. Europe is a unity of principles and an allegiance to principles. Principles shape geography. Geography does not shape principles." End of quote. And this is a truth that Putin has never understood. 1 year on, from the start of his brutal war, Putin has failed to achieve a single one of his strategic goals.
Is it that principle shape geography, or is it that like weather, and some man-made apparatus shape geography, but for the most part, natural things shape geography?
Instead of dividing the European Union, he finds us united and determined to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes.
And China, the strategy of the turning point for peace to counter American hegemony, Beijing allied with Moscow in self-defense, the analysis. Beijing and Moscow share the same disenchanted vision of the international order defined by the West at the end of the Second World War. While the United States is chasing China practically everywhere, mediation in the war in Ukraine would allow the Asian giant to present itself to the international community, especially to the global South, as a responsible player. And like it or not, in large part of the world, especially in Africa and Latin America, Chinese illiberal pragmatism retains enormous appeal. I'm going to disagree almost entirely with this article, but I'll read it to be critical. Solid as one rock, not even the unstable international situation will affect relations between China, Russia, the China-Russia word of Wang Yi, the special envoy appointed by Beijing to President, 12 points of the Chinese peace plan, first bilateral with the homologue Sergei Lavrov, then the meeting at Kremlin by way of Vladimir Putin. After the visit of the head of Chinese diplomacy, friendship without limits between Beijing and Moscow, it's confirmed as granted. Of course, I guess this translation is not too accurate. Of course, the crisis was also discussed to Ukraine. A spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, thanked the Chinese for their consistently balanced position on the matter. Their vision of the two countries on the current international issues largely coincide, he added. Yet behind the pleasantries, the latest warlike speeches by Putin, not to mention Moscow's withdrawal from the New START, certainly do not facilitate the desired mediation of Beijing. We've never talked about a peace plan, the Chinese ambassador to the UN specified on Tuesday, referring to the 12-point position paper released this morning. In the report, the leadership led by Xi Jinping, it simply reiterates the need for one-solution politics to the crisis, limiting itself to condemning the use of nuclear weapons. Again, the usual strategic ambiguity, not that Beijing wants to stay with its arms crossed, but from here to play the role of the peacemaker that passes. And the 12 points of the Chinese peace plan. Here's the complex text of the Beijing to end the war in Ukraine. To understand what they have in mind, Chinese need to reread the recent document on the Global Security Initiative by avoiding taking sides in the conflict. The text promotes the protection of sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, respect for the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN. It's a resolution of differences and controversies across the dialogue and the consultation. Nothing extraordinary. They're more or less the same concepts that have been guiding China's foreign policy since the era of Mao, but between the lines, the unpublished allusion to a possible appears new multilateral strategy. Literally, we speak of a high-level meeting. Just a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal associated the visit of Xi, a Moscow scheduled for April-May, with the intention of starting multi-party peace talks, a formula that, according to Zhang Jiang, professor of the prestigious Fudan University of Shanghai, could allude to the birth of a version Chinese of the Munich Security Conference. Here, the recent pacifist turn also reflects the personal ambitions of Beijing. Mediation in the war would allow the Chinese to present themselves to the international community. Above all, the Sud Global, as a responsible actor, able to protect interests of those countries that don't feel represented by the United States. It's no coincidence that apart from the UN, the ISG doesn't envisage the involvement of any Western organization, but of the Asian involving the countries of Southeast Asia, of the African Union, and of Arab League. Putin secretly decided to invade Ukraine. Lavrov, oligarchs, and Kremlin leaders kept in the dark. It's a new arm wrestling match between Washington and Beijing, consensus between economic models and competitive world views. Together we separate the multipolarismo and democratization in international relations, he said. Wang Yi meeting Lavrov will preserve the trend positive in the development of relations between great powers. This is the point. Beijing and Moscow share the same disenchanted vision of the international order defined by the West at the end of World War II. It's for self-defense, not to please Putin, that the Chinese media, they keep reviving Russian disinformation. Tuesday, Zhang Jun, he went further, officially calling for an investigation of him, or investigation on alleged American sabotage of the Nord Stream. Beijing's not forgotten the U.S. intelligence allegations about the laboratory Wuhan and supporting the propaganda of reciprocated the cheat. If the one in Ukraine is a proxy war, the political economic confrontation between Chinese and the United States is often referred to as a new Cold War. In proper terms, perhaps anachronistic, which however restore the idea of how the butterfly effect between the two sides of the Pacific increasingly have a global impact. While discussing a Pax Seneca between Moscow and Kiev just these days, China and Russia are engaged in joint military exercises off the coast of Durban in South Africa. Already in its second edition, the MOSI 2 operation is creating many problems for the government of listen to Cyril Ramaphosa, already beaten by the European chancelleries for abstaining in the UN vote last March. And I'll hold off on Transnistria for the next section. Watch this space. We'll be back with more world news. And Transnistria news. Russia warns U.S., NATO, and Ukraine over Transnistria. Any action by Ukraine, this is mayornews.com, any action by Ukraine or the West that poses a threat to Russian peacekeepers or nationals in the Moldovan breakaway region of Transnistria will be seen as an attack on Russia, the country's foreign ministry has stated. It warned Kiev and its Western backers against carrying out provocations. According to Russia Today, in a statement released on Friday, Russian diplomats cited data from the country's defense ministry, according to which Ukraine has amassed considerable numbers of military personnel, as well as hardware and artillery on its borders with Transnistria. In light of this, Moscow warned the U.S. NATO member states and their Ukrainian underlings against any further adventurous steps. While Russia favors political diplomatic ways of resolving issues, no one should have any doubt that the Russian armed forces will react appropriately to any provocation by the Kiev regime, the statement reads. Moscow stressed that it's determined to protect its citizens, its peacekeepers, and its military personnel stationed in Moldova's breakaway region. And from the Times now, Russia-Ukraine war live. Russian Defense Ministry claims Ukraine is preparing to invade Transnistria. And from English, alarabia.net, Moldova denies direct threat to Transnistria from Ukraine. Moldova's Ministry of Defense on Friday denied that any direct threat by Ukraine to its pro-Russian separatist region exists in an apparent response to Russian accusations that Kiev was planning to invade Transnistria. Moscow backed Transnistria as a narrow region bordering Ukraine, which after a war separated from Moldova in 1992, Russian soldiers have been deployed there since. The Ministry of Defense monitors all events, actions, and changes taking place in the region and on the territory controlled by Tiraspol authorities, it said in the statement. We affirm that there is currently no direct threat to the military security of Transnistria, it added. The false information distributed is intended to create panic and confusion among people on both sides of the Dniester River. Earlier Friday, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that its army will respond to any provocation by Ukrainian forces in Transnistria. Moscow also reiterated its accusations, alleging Ukraine was deploying a large number of soldiers and arms at the border. In recent years, Moldova, a poor country of 2.6 million people, has taken a pro-Western turn, drawing Moscow's ire. Since the launch of the offensive in Ukraine a year ago, the Kremlin has been accused of raising tensions in Transnistria to destabilize Ukraine and Moldova. Russia's defense ministry on Thursday claimed that Ukraine has stepped up preparations for the invasion of Transnistria, and Moldova responded by saying that state authorities do not confirm the information released by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Earlier this month, Moldovan President Maya Sandu accused Russia of plotting to violently overthrow her government through saboteurs disguised as anti-government protesters, claims that Russia denied. On Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin revoked a 2012 decree that partly supported Moldova's sovereignty and was designed to serve as a framework to resolve the future of the breakaway region of Transnistria. The order signed Tuesday indicated that the decision was taken to guarantee the national interests of Russia in the context of profound changes taking place in international relations. And from AA.com, Russian Foreign Ministry warns U.S., NATO, Ukraine against reckless steps in Transnistria. Ministry says any actions posing threats to Russia's military contingent in breakaway Transnistria region will be considered under international law as an attack on Moscow. The Russian Foreign Ministry warned the U.S., NATO, and Ukraine against reckless steps in Transnistria amid an alleged deployment of the Ukrainian troops in the region in the battle order. In a statement on its official website, the diplomatic service, with a link to the Defense Ministry's data, said, Ukraine has accumulated a significant number of personnel, military equipment, and artillery in firing positions on the Ukrainian Transnistria border, unprecedentedly increased flights of its drones over the territory of Transnistria. We warn the U.S., NATO member countries, and the Ukrainian boards from the next reckless steps, the ministry said. Moscow consistently advocates for resolving any issues through political and diplomatic means. However, no one should have any doubts that the Russian army will adequately respond to the provocation and will ensure the protection of its compatriots, the Russian peacekeeping contingent, the servicemen of the operational group of Russian troops, and military depots in the locality of Kabazna in Transnistria, it emphasized. Any actions that pose a threat to the security or to their security will be considered in accordance with the international law as an attack on the Russian Federation, the ministry said. The Russian Defense Ministry on Thursday claimed that Ukraine's preparing an armed provocation against Transnistria, an unrecognized breakaway region internationally recognized as part of Moldova. The statement claimed that an offensive against Russian troops in the breakaway region is planned to be staged, with Ukrainian forces allegedly being dressed in the uniform of the Russian armed forces. In response, the Moldovan government said in the statement that authorities do not confirm the claims made by the Russian Defense Ministry. And from IntelliNews, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed on February 23rd that the Ukraine is preparing a complex operation aimed at eventually invading the pro-Russian separatist Transnistria region in Moldova. Moldova officials said that they're not in possession of such reports, and Russian statements are instead part of a hybrid war. There are fears that Russia will escalate the war in Ukraine and potentially embroil Moldova around the one-year anniversary of the invasion. The government in Kiev plans to carry out an operation under a false flag as a pretext for invading Transnistria in the near future, the Russian Ministry of Defense said on February 23rd. Russian diplomats said Kiev plans to stage what would appear to be an offensive by Russian troops from the territory of Transnistria. The invasion would then be carried out by units of the armed forces of Ukraine with the involvement of the Azov nationalist formation. For this, the Ukrainian saboteurs participating in the staged invasion will be dressed in the uniform of the military personnel of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, they added. Moldovan officials denied there was any threat that Ukraine would invade Transnistria, and the statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense about possible provocations of Ukraine in the Transnistrian region represent a psychological operation rather than real intentions, said the Secretary of State from the Moldovan Ministry of Defense, Valeria Mija, during the public space show on Radio Moldova. They follow a warning from Ukrainian intelligence that Moscow is plotting to destabilize Moldova, where it's long backed the separatist regime in Transnistria. Moldovan President Maia Sandu, Prime Minister Dorian Risian, and other Moldova officials have recently talked up scrapping the country's long-standing military neutrality and hinted that the country might consider NATO membership. That drew an angry response from Russian officials. Moscow's fierce opposition to Ukraine joining NATO was one of the reasons for Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. Meanwhile, the de facto government in Transnistria said that it has the situation under control and that no provocation will be carried out from its territory. The official noted, however, that the state authorities must carefully monitor the situation and be vigilant. The separatist authorities in Transnistria mentioned the Russian peacekeeping troops on their territory, saying that any intimidation gesture against them would be an unjustified crime. Dianis Sanus of the think tank EESC in Lithuania and Moldova and the BNE IntelliNews columnists wrote on Twitter that it would make little sense of Kiev to attack Transnistria. The hysteria around the Transnistria region can be reduced if opponents of Russian aggression manage to establish a joint information front, he added. And from TRT World, Foreign Ministry says any actions that threaten Russia's security will be considered an attack on Moscow in accordance with the international law. The Russian Foreign Ministry has warned the U.S., NATO, and Ukraine against reckless steps in Transnistria amid an alleged deployment of Ukrainian troops in the breakaway region. In a statement on its official website, the diplomatic service, with a link to the Russian Defense Ministry's data, said on Thursday that Ukraine has accumulated a significant number of personnel, military equipment, and artillery in firing positions on the Ukrainian Transnistrian border, and unprecedentedly increased flights of its drones over the territory of Transnistria. We warn the U.S. NATO member countries and their Ukrainian boards from the next reckless steps, the ministry said. Moscow advocates for resolving any issues through political and diplomatic means. However, no one should have any doubts that the Russian army will adequately respond to the provocation and will ensure the protection of its compatriots, it's emphasized. On its first anniversary, Russia-Ukraine conflict has reached stalemate, with neither side having achieved its stated military goals, it says in that tweet. Armed provocation. Any actions that pose a threat to their security will be considered in accordance with international law as an attack on the Russian Federation, the ministry said. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that Ukraine is preparing an armed provocation against Transnistria, an unrecognized breakaway region internationally recognized as part of Moldova. The statement claimed that an offensive against Russian troops in the breakaway region is planned to be staged, with Ukrainian forces allegedly being dressed in the uniform of the Russian armed forces. In response, the Moldovan government said in a statement that authorities do not confirm the claims made by the Russian Defense Ministry. And the dive with Jackson Hewitt, Ukraine and NATO. Oh, Jackson Hinkle, excuse me. Ukraine and NATO update here.
And the United Nations actually thanked Russia for doing that. So they have thoroughly infiltrated Ukrainian intelligence, and now what they have learned is that the Ukrainians are attempting to do this. Okay, so they're going to be dressing up like Russians. The implementation of the planned provocation by the Ukrainian authorities poses a direct threat to the Russian peacekeeping contingent deployed legally in Transnistria. The armed forces of the Russian Federation will adequately respond to the planned provocation of the Ukrainian side. That's according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. But there's been a little shakeup in Moldovan politics recently. Not anything revolutionary, but this right here. Freshly baked Prime Minister of the Republic of Moldova says Transnistria must be demilitarized, meaning he's saying they want, the Russian presence out, the peacekeeping presence that's been there for years, out of Transnistria. Prime Minister Dorn Risian said that Transnistria must be demilitarized. Russian troops must leave, after which it will be necessary to integrate the inhabitants of the region economically and socially. Remember the SMO in Transnistria when Moldovan troops were firing directing into houses? Yeah, we cleaned that up too. So Moldova is a country that will, in all likelihood, probably try as ambitions to join NATO, and it's not a part of it yet. But the Moldovan government right now is saying that they want the Russian peacekeepers out of Transnistria, and they're very serious about this. And I think it's probably something that, the Moldovan government is trying to do to show that they're willing to join NATO, and they're serious about joining NATO. They want to join NATO, okay?
Yeah, and in one sense you could say, okay, the Soviet Union was shrewd and conniving in creating this geopolitic based around these really small strips of land that could eventually be reunited to, it could reform the Soviet Union, but it also could just maintain border integrity at the same time. So, it could be shrewd, conniving, or it could be preventative. It's really hard to say.
The Moldovan people are not so happy about this. Massive demonstration 1 day ago, in Moldova in support of Russia. Take a look. They're chanting their support for Russia. You will definitely see no traces of this in Western mainstream media, Dmitry Polyansky, First Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia, has to say. It doesn't fit their perception of what people should think in Moldova, just as it doesn't fit the perception of Western elites when you see Ukrainians like Tatiana Montyan speaking out against the abuses and the efforts of the, captured Ukrainian government to go to war against the people of the Donbass and Russia as well. We saw this as well from the ousted Ukrainian presidential spokesperson Arestovich. I believe that was his name, right? If Moldova asks Ukraine, the armed forces of Ukraine will take Transnistria in 3 days, according to Arestovich. Yes. War Monitor tweeted this out and said, "Wake up, Mom. New 3-day statement just dropped." Okay, so we'll see what happens. War Monitor also published this just earlier today. According to the Russian Defense Ministry earlier today, Kiev has stepped up preparations for the invasion of Transnistria, so they are further developing plans to do this. According to a very popular Ukrainian journalist, Lachin, they just posted this on his Telegram. Attention residents of the temporarily occupied territory of Moldova, basically implying that they're going to kick the Russian peacekeepers out because they see it as a temporary occupation. It wasn't too long ago, if you're concerned that maybe I'm getting the story wrong, look at this. It wasn't too long ago when NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg came out and said this right here about Moldova.
Including to NATO's comprehensive assistance package. This is providing Ukraine with food, fuel, medical supplies, counter-drone systems, and amphibious bridges. Ministers also discussed our commitment to our other partners at risk, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Moldova. And we agreed to step up tailored support to enhance their defense capabilities, resilience.
So this is what NATO told Ukraine with their special partnership they've had for the past several years. They told Ukraine before this whole war broke out that we're going to increase our support for the defense potential of Ukraine. Now they're saying they're going to increase their support for the defense potential of Georgia and Moldova. Now we know who wants government change in Moldova. They got it, and now the new government, with this little shakeup, is saying that they want to push Russian peacekeepers out of Transnistria. And let me just be the first to tell you, it's going to take more than 3 days to push them out. And there will probably be, who knows, maybe not, but there will probably be a very large Russian response because of the fact that in Transnistria is one of the largest arms storage sites in all of Europe. I think it might be the largest in all of Europe. We also had this. War Monitor posted this. It is very important that we divert a part of the troops in that direction of Moldova because if a point of instability appears there, we have to react to it. So that's today at 2:35 p.m. after the Russian Defense Ministry said that Ukraine was preparing their provocation against Moldova. That was from the Secretary of Ukraine's Security and Defense Council. So now the Ukrainians are actually coming out and admitting the fact that, yes, we're going to be diverting troops to this part of Moldova. And now we have photo proof as well. Unconfirmed image reportedly showing AFU presence outside the town of Palanka, Moldova. Okay, so here you have what is thought to be Ukrainian troops moving in that direction. All right. And lastly, I want to show you this. Gonzalo Lira shared this video from Military Summary and Analysis channel on YouTube, giving a brief, pretty accurate analysis of the situation.
Hello, my dear.
That is currently unfolding in Moldova with Ukrainian efforts of a provocation. Let's take a look.
Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and this morning we have something to discuss. Today I took a decision to make an extra video this morning of the local time of 7 a.m. of local time. The thing is that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation this morning reported that according to information they have, within the next few days, the Ukrainian army is going to make some kind of provocation on the territory of Moldova, or to be more precise, on the territory of Transnistria. The Russians are saying that Ukrainians have already accumulated their forces on the roads that connects in the vicinity of Balta and Okny, these two towns, and the Ukrainians accumulated their forces along these two roads, the first road on the north and the second road of the south. And the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians are planning to make some kind of provocation, that Ukrainians are planning to change their uniform and to use the uniform of the soldiers of Russian Federation. And using this uniform, the Ukrainians, according to the Russians, are planning to start some kind of fake offensive operation from Transnistria in direction of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are planning to use this case as the case to begin their own special military operation in direction of Transnistria. The main thing that Ukrainians are going to achieve, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, is to establish control over the warehouses that located on the territory of Transnistria. As you know, there are a lot of warehouses on the territory of Transnistria, the old Soviet warehouses, and the Ukrainians need them. The Ukrainians have lack of artillery systems. They have a lot of old Soviet artillery systems. They have a lot of Western artillery systems, but they don't have, the Ukrainians don't produce their own 152mm shells. And if they're able to establish control over the warehouses that located on the territory of Transnistria, then they will be able to continue. These shells will be enough for another year of war on the territory.
So, of course, this is all.
And there we have it. We'll return with more news. Make sure you watch this space. And remember, your engagement through a like, share, subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Spiderweb Speech 2, Israeli media on Saeed Nasrallah's speech. This is almayadeen.net. Israeli media says Syed Hassan Nasrallah's recent speech revived the cobweb theory of Israeli society. An article published in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz touched on the recent speech delivered by Hezbollah's Secretary General Saeed Hassan Nasrallah. This speech said that it's being described in Israel as a spiderweb speech 2. At the celebration of the liberation of southern Lebanon from the Israeli occupation on May 25, 2000, Saeed Nasrallah described Israel as weaker than a spider's web. The article said that a second security development is taking place in Lebanon, of all places, an arena that was supposed to become quiescent following the signing of the maritime border agreement with Israel last October. It claimed that Saeed Nasrallah discerns from his viewpoint on internal weakness in Israel against the background of the broad constitutional and political crisis and is starting to issue threats. It highlighted that Saeed Nasrallah's words were accompanied by steps on the ground, including the alleged arrival of Iranian air defense systems to Lebanon, which eroded the Israeli Air Force's superiority in the skies, in addition to the deployment of dozens of Hezbollah observation points along the border with occupied Palestine. In the same context, an article published in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv considered that the Hezbollah Secretary General pounced on the deep crisis afflicting Israeli society. It said that Saeed Nasrallah's words threatened to expose the consensus necessary for joint service in the occupation army and to expose the solidarity of the majority of the different population groups in society during any future fighting. The article indicated that the Lebanese leader once again revived the cobweb theory of Israeli society, warning that from week to week, the crisis inside Israel becomes more dangerous. In a related context, the Ma'ariv article pointed to the state of frustration and despair that prevails in the general atmosphere in Israel, highlighting that Israel's going through horrible days, which may lead the Zionist dream to an unprecedented rift and perhaps even its end. Ma'ariv concluded that millions of Israelis feel that it's the end of the world. Israeli dilemma in facing Iranian nuclear file. On its part, the Israeli Channel 12 broadcasted an extensive report that included interviews with former Israeli occupation officers on the Israeli dilemma in facing the Iranian nuclear file. The report said that they will not be surprised in Israel by the reported information that Iran has succeeded in enriching uranium in small quantities to the level of 84%. And this has been known here for a long time. We actually covered that pretty extensively here on TR News, especially the idea that uranium can be enriched past the amount that a centrifuge would like for it to be enriched just by happenstance. It claimed that the Iranians have now reached the last red line, the ability to enrich to a level of 90%, sufficient to produce enough materials for a nuclear bomb. The channel wondered about the capabilities of Israel in exchange for this Iranian step, saying, "What can we really accomplish?" And also from Al-Mayadeen, chaos in Lebanon to extend to U.S. protege Israel, Saeed Nasrallah says. Hezbollah chief Saeed Hassan Nasrallah underlines that the chaos the West is planning for Lebanon would engulf the whole region in flames, especially the Israeli occupation. The resistance accomplishments were all only realized due to the blood of the commanders and the martyrs in all resistance factions, the Lebanese army, the Palestinian resistance factions, and the Syrian Arab army. Hezbollah Secretary General Saeed Hassan Nasrallah said on Thursday, during a speech commemorating the commanders of the resistance, "Commemorating the martyred commanders each year is an expression of our loyalty and appreciation for them, their struggle, their sacrifices, as well as their venerable Saeed Abbas al-Musawi's wife, Yasser, said Saeed Nasrallah said. He also lauded the resistance commanders, underlining how they adhered to resistance despite all the difficulties and betrayals they faced. Commemorating them aims to serve as a reminder and reintroduce them once again, because many of those from the new generation might not know what happened 30 or 40 years ago," he said. "Much can be inspired by their stories in the face of the current circumstances and challenges. Conserving resistance vital. The resistance accomplishments are everyone's responsibility, and this is an ongoing battle, the most important issue in which is conserving those. There's an ongoing battle in the face of the U.S. media, the politics, and economic tools, at the forefront of which is the dollar rate in Lebanon," Saeed Hassan Nasrallah said. "What helps the Americans in their plans is there being corruption and administrative issues in their target country," the Lebanese resistance leader said, underlining the need for initiatives and plans against the planned chaos, the hegemony, and the brainwashing against our people. Additionally, the Hezbollah chief stressed that if Lebanon's pushed into chaos, then the world must brace for chaos all over the region. most notably within your protege, Israel. As we were prepared for war in defense of our gas, just as we are prepared to point our guns at our protege Israel, he added. Regarding the extraction of gas from the Mediterranean, the resistance leader highlighted that the resistance would never allow the postponing of the extraction of oil from Lebanese waters, warning against any postponement of the sort and telling Americans to stay away from the issue. Saeed Nasrallah mourns earthquake victims, and that is not related. This is presidency issue must be resolved. The agreement with the Free Patriotic Movement is in critical condition, the Hezbollah chief said, hoping that the accords preserved for the sake of national interest. There's nothing new regarding the Lebanese presidential issue, he revealed. This merits internal, and no one can impose a president on the country. It's necessary for the state to continue looking for ways to solve the issue of the presidency. What's currently taking place in Lebanon, Saeed Nasrallah said, mainly the unrefined or the unreined dollar rate that's on the rise, is due to U.S. pressure and the monitoring of funds being drawn from banks. There needs to be an effort aimed at bolstering the Lebanese economy and looking for alternative markets such as China and Russia, he underscored. We cannot wait to satisfy the Americans for our crisis to be resolved, and there are no limits to the U.S. demands in any direct negotiations. Occupation, government pushing toward major clashes. Regarding the domestic situation in the Israeli occupation, Saeed Nasrallah stressed that the foolish enemy government is pushing toward two major clashes. The first clash is an internal Israeli conflict, while the other is a conflict within Palestine, he clarified. The confrontation with Palestine might extend to include the rest of the region. The internal situation in Israel is unprecedented, especially in light of certain Israeli parties talking about internal war, he added. The president of the occupation himself admitted to fearing an imminent internal expansion and the occupation collapsing. We highly revere the Palestinian people, especially the young generation in Al-Quds, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, he continued. The region is before real Palestine resistance and a real Palestinian intifada, and they're both embraced by the Palestinian people. The West aiming to undermine Iran. There was no coverage in Western media and certain Arab media of the mass rallies that took place in Iran on the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, in which millions took to the streets, Saeed Nasrallah highlighted. The Western world ignored the million-strong rally in Iran at a time when it focused on some riots to incite against Iran. Iranians took to the streets of more than 1,400 Iranian cities to commemorate the 44th anniversary of the victory of the Islamic Revolution. And we're going to retrieve some data just a moment. Okay, so before we moved on, I just wanted to show a bit of footage of the Iranian 44th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution here. Iranians revere Islamic Revolution. Celebrations across 1,400 cities. Plunging us into security, the situation has shown us that at these 44 years, we do not appreciate the revolution. Today, in the light of these events, I've come with my family to ensure and to pay tribute to the revolution, she says. Tens of thousands of Iranians arrive at Azadi Square. Iranians chant, display. There's a 2-year gap. This is since 79. 44 years. So yeah, of course, this is skipped over in Western media, but there is patriotism and pro-Islamism in Iran for sure. All right, so there we are. Watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, share, and subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
The whole notion of logic.
Of course. Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger? Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again. Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed. Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
The whole notion of logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr.
Jordan, Egypt try to mediate, stop Israeli-Palestinian escalation, report says. Jordan will host a meeting of Israeli and Palestinian representatives which aims to de-escalate and re-engage the two sides. Jordan will be the host to a meeting between Israeli and Palestinian representatives on Sunday, Jordanian news outlet Al-Ghad reported on Thursday. The newspaper quotes an informed source saying that the meeting will be attended by the representatives of Egypt and the U.S. and aims to end unilateral steps to restore political engagement between the two sides. This comes following a deadly IDF-IOF raid in Nablus and the subsequent rocket fire from Gaza into Israel earlier this week. The meeting, which will reportedly include Israelis, Palestinians, and regional and international participants, will be the first meeting of its kind in many years, per the report. Stopping all unilateral measures will be the main starting point for stopping the deterioration of the situation, and it'll be one of the main issues of discussion at the meeting. The source added that Jordan's made intensive efforts in the past to stop unilateral steps and escalating measures that would bring about more cycles of violence. Jordan also took economic and security measures to lessen the suffering of Palestinians. Diplomatic sources added that the meeting comes at a very sensitive time and is thus of major importance. The source told Al-Ghad that the meeting's a necessary step to reach Palestinian-Israeli understandings that would stop the deterioration and pave the way for more general engagement in the future. London-based Arab newspaper Al-Arabi Al-Jadid reported on Friday that Egypt had intensive contact with Palestinian factions to prevent further escalation of violence. A source told Al-Arabi Al-Jadid that the Egyptian mediators especially tried to persuade the factions in Gaza not to fire rockets into Israel, as this would only push Israel to launch a military operation in the Gaza Strip. The leaders of the Gaza factions responded by saying the principle of the unity of the theater cannot be abolished, and that the process of launching rockets will continue and may develop into other qualitative operations, according to the source. Egypt also turned to the U.S., asking them to put pressure on Israel not to escalate the violence further, this source said. And now a bit of historical framing. This is from Expose the Enemy, and it's regarding conscious opposition to Zionism around the time of World War II.
Einstein, who, along with maybe we could call them Jews of conscience, some of them might have even been Zionists of conscience, maybe you could say Einstein was that, wrote a letter, a public letter to the New York Times when Menachem Begin came to the United States. Quote, I'm going to quote that letter. This is to the New York Times, December 4th, 1948. Quote, New Palestine Party, visit of Menachem Begin and aims of political movement discussed. To the editor of the New York Times, among the most disturbing political phenomena of our time is the emergence in the newly created state of Israel of the quote-unquote Freedom Party, Tnuat Ha'erut, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. It was formed out of the membership and following of the former Irgun Zvai Leumi, a terrorist right-wing chauvinist organization in Palestine. The current visit of Menachem Begin, leader of this party, to the United States is obviously calculated to give the impression of American support for his party in the coming Israeli elections and to cement political ties with conservative Zionist elements in the United States. Several Americans of national repute have lent their names to welcome his visit. It is inconceivable that those who oppose fascism throughout the world, if correctly informed as to Mr. Begin's political record and perspectives, could add their names in support to the movement he represents. Before irreparable damage is done by way of financial contributions, public manifestations in Begin's half, and the creation in Palestine of the impression that a large segment of America supports fascist elements in Israel, the American public must be informed as to the record and objectives of Mr. Begin and his movement. The public avowals of Begin's party are no guide whatever to its actual character. Today they speak of freedom, democracy, and anti-imperialism, whereas until recently they openly preached the doctrine of the fascist state. It is in its actions that the terrorist party betrays its real character. From its past actions, we can judge what it may be expected to do in the future. Attack on Arab village. Go, Greg.
Wow, this is worth a whole show or two, a whole show or series of shows on its own. I mean, there's a lot of parallels between then and now. Like, this whole thing is nothing new, and the people who want to misrepresent and deliberately misinform people and disinform people about like this dynamic is nothing new. And I was even thinking about like a couple of examples. I know we're getting off on another tangent here, but I feel like this is a combination of like the way that these, maybe more liberal secular Jews that are not down with the Zionist state, like they're seen as it's interesting that Netanyahu has, I'm sure he knows this history, but he's upholding Einstein as this great genius that the then prime minister of China, or then head of China, sees as like this great example of Jewish genius in the world and all this. And but like Einstein, much like there's Jewish intellectuals now who are very opposed to the at least the more hardline elements of the Jewish state, the state of Israel. This was the case back then too, and it's interesting even bringing in Begin and the animosity towards Begin from these more liberal types of secular Jewish types, and then even the commonality. One more, I'll just name a quick parallel, would be the way that Jimmy Carter almost spoke of Begin as like having this religious supremacy around him, like he got a sense of like that Begin was a religious supremacist. He wrote about that. And then I contrast that with Jerry Falwell Sr. receiving a private jet from Begin because of the great lengths that he advanced the U.S.-Israel relationship under Begin's time as prime minister. So there's a lot of, I mean, this would be a fascinating topic to talk about more in depth because there's a lot there. But basically my point is that like this whole conflict, it's been going on for a long time. There's people who want to misrepresent or not even lay that out, like the whole idea of the monolithic conspiracy and all this, like that get lost in this. This is nothing new, and it's something that's been going on for a long time, and it's only escalated more with time and become more public because of the escalatory sense of the situation we find ourselves in now that has been building over the decades. But it's nothing new. and you can replace the names. You can replace Begin with Netanyahu. You can replace, and it becomes very similar to what we're seeing now, but even more, I'd say, more escalated now.
Yeah, and on top of that, you could just print this letter again today and just sort of replace the names, and immediately these people, such as Albert Einstein, who Netanyahu takes as the Jewish people who produce such geniuses as Albert Einstein on this letter, or Hannah Arendt, one of the most important moral philosophers of the 20th century, Jewish woman. And these people would immediately be un-Jewed by the Natan Sharansky credibly accused Soviet police agent types, who then, by the way, I went on this Zoom call yesterday while I was doing other things by the Institute of Anti-Semitism Studies, and they were, the main presenter, an academic guy, was basically doing this whole drafting off of a woman's Soviet studies in terms of sort of Soviet architecture of aspects of anti-Semitism in conjunction with anti-Westernism and anti-imperialism, was basically giving a line very similar to what we saw in the Jerusalem presentation of the Daily Wire, the Shapiro and Jordan Peterson event. And so then I had time to pose a question in the Q&A part in terms of, I wrote it down and I said, will you address the issue of Herzl's anti-Semitism and call of the fascist calls to saying that the anti-Semites will be our best friends, or Jabotinsky's calls for fascist overtones of iron in relationship to the relationship of Zionism, the history of Zionism in terms of anti-Semitism and authoritarianism, because that was also a part of it. And then after that, they didn't read the question. But then Christine Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, and one of these, key people actually in terms of, even more key than Ghislaine herself in terms of the Israeli military intelligence sector and its relationship with Silicon Valley, especially Microsoft, deep, the Talpiot twins, as we titled them, Christine and Isabel. She comes on after to basically just high-five these other folks. Now, there was some pushback there, but this whole aspect, the rise again of weaponized, really sort of Zionist propaganda-based, I think, anti-Semitism studies, and the total, I would say, the total moral hypocrisy at its core, and what it's not willing to talk about in terms of the internal history of Zionist politics, is proof positive that this exact discourse in this letter from many decades ago is more relevant than ever.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
And it's definitely the case that these Jews who wrote this letter to the New York Times would definitely be called self-hating Jews, un-Jewed, dupes of anti-Semites worldwide, and all of that kind of thing. And meanwhile, this letter would be even more powerful today because they were proven exactly right in terms of what would happen if the people, with the Jewish people and the American government and the American people, were to accept these fascist terrorists. They're very clear. They use language like terrorism, fascism, supremacism. I think they use at some point that this was going to indicate a very bad move. And now we have just decades and decades of even deepening and worsening historical proof that they were correct. Now we've got decades of more ethnic cleansing, more decades of military occupation, more decades of terrorism, of really security destroying espionage in relationship to the indispensable ally of the United States. We've got attempts to assassinate Jewish American ambassadors. We have credibly accused big terrorism. Like Menachem Begin, it was like the Netanyahu types were like, Menachem Begin, hold my beer. Watch this global terrorism. And now, like you brought up, Greg, now there's a whole nother part of this where we have this contemporary political context where it's not just this analysis. Now there's this whole other analysis of authoritarianism and this transnational aspect that then is related to this multipolar turn, especially between these, amongst these figures of people like Putin, Netanyahu, Trump, Orban, Bolsonaro, this whole Modi, that whole aspect, Xi, and so this is this has been heightened, and I think that actually we're probably at the height since that time of the potential calling into serious focus the real threat of what is going on in terms of this what's become of this Zionist project, and more. And another story that just came out is this is an international consortium of journalists exposing, quote, hacks, bots, and blackmail, how secret cyber mercenaries disrupt elections. And this is coming out all over the place. In terms of The Guardian, it's coming out in Haaretz and Times of Israel, French newspapers, and this is an expose of a key Israeli political warfare cyber cell. And mainly two brothers call themselves Team Jorge, and they claim to have worked on intelligence and influence services and that worked on 33, that's an interesting number, presidential level campaigns, 27 of them quote unquote successful. Their tactics include hacking, forging blackmail material, spreading disinformation, planning false intelligence, physically disrupting elections, and deploying targeted social media campaigns. And Jorge has been exposed as Atal Hanan, a self-described counterterrorism expert who has been cited in the media as a cybersecurity specialist, and his brother. And that we'll link to some of these stories, but it turns out he was linked in, of course, with Cambridge Analytica and that whole central political warfare component of the 11/9 operation. So this is getting exposed. This is beginning to escalate. The exposure of this, the politics domestically inside of Israel, the growing concern inside of the United States in terms of, politically focused people committed to freedom and democracy, but also people committed to national security. So things are coming to a head, and so that's one reason I wanted to actually that set me off when I saw Bibi reference Einstein, and because I remember this letter, and I used to reference it a lot because it's such a stunning piece in terms of sort of how things have changed, but also how they've stayed the same in many ways.
Yes, and looking at this from a domestic American standpoint, look at 1948 and 2022, or 2023 now, and in this situation, you still had the quote unquote democratic, and there was no way this could come to America, or the quote unquote stabilized Western countries. Yes, of course, there's been long-term collaboration, and obviously the original sins of the recognition of Israel and the power that the Israel lobby through media and government would have over our institutions and over our politicians. And there's been periods where it's been more pronounced than other periods, maybe during the presidency of a Lyndon Johnson or certainly George W. Bush. But now we've reached the situation where, in addition to all this, there's been this long-term weaponized destabilizing of the west of Western Europe, but in general, I'd say, but the United States in particular, to the point to where someone who is just where you have the rise of a Trump-like figure. We're not only in a situation where he's in office, but is out of office, tried to stage a coup against the government that was going to be following him into power, and now has the opportunity to be installed back into power. And not just Donald Trump, but basically you've got a primary where it's going to be Trump-like people who may not behave like him. They may be more polished than him, more respectable in the way they speak publicly, but they're beholden to this same agenda and to these same interests. And so we've got where now like an entire subset of our political culture, or one of our major two political institutionalized parties, is now entirely full of people that would lead us into this direction, whether it's Donald Trump doing it or not. You've got a whole bunch of would-be Trumps in waiting. And so it's really, that's another part of the escalatory nature of this, just how infiltrated and taken over our political system has become. Not just the usual bipartisan corruption, but now where like an entire political party and its politicians and representatives and everything that comes with it are pretty much entirely taken over. And so that's where we're facing in this moment, in addition to all the other ways that it's escalated. Like now we've got the threats of foreign, but now you've got it right here, and it's, I'd say, taken over a very significant portion of our society.
Definitely. And Greg, I want to finish this letter if that's okay. I just think it makes sense to sort of complete it.
Yeah, let's do it. All
right. And remember, this is from this is the Freedom Party, right, that they're calling out. Menachem Begin so from the Freedom Party to the Freedom Caucus, I don't know. All right, back to this letter. I think it was printed on December 4th, 1948, but they wrote it on December 2nd, or they signed it on and sent it in on December 2nd. Okay, quote, "Attack on Arab village. A shocking example was their behavior in the Arab village of Deir Yassin. This village, off the main roads and surrounded by Jewish lands, had taken no part in the war, and it even fought off Arab bands who wanted to use the village as their base. On April 9th, in the New York Times, they're sourcing the New York Times, terrorist bands attacked this peaceful village, which was not a military objective in the fighting, killed most of its inhabitants, 240 men, women, and children, and kept a few of them alive to parade as captives through the streets of Jerusalem. Most of the Jewish community was horrified at the deed, and the Jewish agency sent a telegram of apology to King Abdullah of Transjordan. But the terrorists, far from being ashamed of their act, were proud of this massacre, publicized it widely, and invited all the foreign correspondents present in the country to view the heaped corpses and the general havoc at Deir Yassin. The Deir Yassin incident exemplifies the character and actions of the Freedom Party. Within the Jewish community, they have preached an admixture of ultranationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority. Like other fascist parties, they have been used to break strikes, and they have themselves pressed for the destruction of free trade unions. In their stead, they have proposed corporate unions on the Italian fascist model. During the last years of sporadic anti-British violence, the IZL and Stern groups inaugurated a reign of terror in the Palestine Jewish community. Teachers were beaten up for speaking against them. Adults were shot for not letting their children join them. Unquote. But by the way, this is right. This is exactly what they accuse Hamas of in terms of the Palestinian community, right? Or Islamic Jihad, or just any usually sort of any kind of organized Palestinian organization, right? But this is the origins also of the quote-unquote security state of Israel too. All right.
And not also, but the origins period. Like to say that Hamas is doing that, there's no proof of that. It could be projection, especially considering that this is well before Hamas was established, that this was written objectively.
And once again, as I always point out, Zionists don't preserve Jews from their targets of terrorism and destruction. Sometimes they will target them, potentially. All right, quote, teachers were beaten up for speaking against them. Adults were shot for not letting their children join them. By gangster methods, beatings, window smashing, and widespread robberies, the terrorists intimidated the population and exacted a heavy tribute. The people of the Freedom Party had no part in the constructive achievements in Palestine. They have reclaimed no land, built no settlements, and only detracted from the Jewish defense activity. Their much publicized immigration endeavors were minute and devoted mainly to bringing in fascist compatriots. Discrepancies seen. The discrepancies between the bold claims now being made by Begin and his party and their record of past performance in Palestine bear the imprint of no ordinary political party.
Your inconsistencies
This is the
are glaringly
stamp
obvious.
of a fascist party for whom terrorism against Jews, Arabs, and British alike, and misrepresentation are means, and a quote-unquote leader state is the goal. In the light of the foregoing considerations, it is imperative that the truth about Mr. Begin and his movement be made known in this country. It is all the more tragic that the top leadership of American Zionism has refused to campaign against Begin's efforts, or even to expose to its own constituents the dangers to Israel from support to Begin. The undersigned therefore take this means of publicly presenting a few salient facts concerning Begin and his party, and of urging all concerned not to support this latest manifestation of fascism. And then it lists
And finally, we have George Galloway on Zionism.
I don't think they've failed at all to understand it. Zionism is Jewish nationalism, and the British, in the form of the Balfour Declaration, endorsed Zionism by granting, on behalf of one people, land to a second people, which belonged to a third people, and which didn't even fall in the British Empire at the time that the promise was made. So it was unique even by imperial standards for that time. Balfour, on behalf of the British, promised the Zionists on behalf of the Jewish people of the world, though most of them were not Zionists and many of them were viscerally hostile to Zionism, the land which belonged to a third people, the Palestinian people. So I don't think it's that they don't understand it. They support it. They support it because, in the words of one of Balfour's cabinet colleagues, it would produce a loyal British Ulster in the Middle East, and so it did. Now it's a loyal American statelet in the Middle East, and that's something to have. And for a long time it threatened and countermanded, or undermined rather, the relations of the British and the Americans with the Arab world. But it doesn't really any longer, at least not with the rulers of the Arab world, who've all made their peace with Zionism. So now that that is the case, it's full speed ahead in support of Israeli nationalism, which is all that Zionism now really. I don't.
And I'd like to see what happens with this Jordan, Egypt, Israel, Palestine meeting coming up next week. Yeah, but with that, I'm going to open a channel here. And let's see. Let me hail the ship.
Beam me up, Mr. Spock. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up.
Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.